All right. I'm Adam with Curious Christianity, and today's question is: was there animal death before the fall of Adam and Eve? I think it is this question that bothers more people than any other question concerning the debate of the young earth versus old earth creationism. This is one of the most central questions that everyone wants to know about because I think it's has the most significant theological implications. So, the main verse that I think that everyone's going to point to is Romans 5:12. Therefore, just as sin entered into the world through one man, death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. Very important that we focus in on this verse. I think that the primary reading of that is that all death has come into the world through man. But of course, the counter objection is this notion that it is only for man that death comes into this world, that this verse is very much focused around all people, all men, all have sinned. And when it says because all sinned, it's referring to mankind. So keep that in mind. And I am going to cover a bunch of information. And I hope that this very much brings about different thoughts for you to considering this issue. It is the central issue that has also been extremely interesting and difficult for me because I absolutely believed and had the idea of a no animal death before the fall of mankind. But these arguments were things that I had never considered. And I think it's important for anyone to consider them. So let's get started. All right. Number one thing I want to address. Did God create a perfect world? Did God create a perfect world? This comes up all of the time in these arguments and debates. And while I was arguing with somebody, they brought up the notion that, well, God created a perfect world in the beginning. And if the world wasn't perfect, then it doesn't make sense for a perfect creator to create something not perfect. He has to create something that is perfect. False. And I totally think that people need to stop using this vernacular. For some people, it's purely semantic, but for others, it's a serious theological point. And I think it's a complete error. A lot of people are pointing to the future and they're like, no, we need to get back to the garden. We need to get back to how the garden was. And they believe that this idea that in the future, we will be going back to something like the garden. I think this is completely wrong. And I think it's wrong for several reasons. And I think we should completely avoid this idea that the future is what the garden was like. And they might use verses that are talking about the lion and the lamb laying together in the future. But I think these are very much confused. Like this idea that we're moving forward and that the future is going to be like the past is a huge mistake. So, in the beginning, God created everything and it was perfect. Is that what the Bible says? Let me suggest to you, no. In fact, I would love to see one verse that says that's how it was. In fact, when you go back and read Genesis, it says what? And it was good. It was very good. It was good. It was good. Day after day, it's talking about creation. It's saying it was very good. Nowhere does it say it's perfect. And I think this distinction is very important. It's important for multiple reasons, but the big one that to me absolutely is a major linchpin in here is the part where God says it is not good. It is not good for Adam to be alone. Now you have to remember that God created Adam alone. He intentionally created Adam by himself. He intentionally created Adam incomplete, alone, and in not good fashion, right? Adam needed something more. So I think it's very clear that God could create something imperfect. Now, just because he creates it imperfect at that moment, he was going to bring about the resolution of this issue, but it was not fixed yet. He still had to bring about Eve. Eve was coming in to complete Adam, but he didn't start that way. And so this idea that God can't create something imperfect, I think is a huge error in reasoning and thinking. And not only that or whatever, it also potentially could be this idea that the earth itself was partially chaotic or disorganized when he initially created it. And now I know there are some Christians who argue against this notion. But again, it's not wrong or bad for God to create something unorganized with a plan to fulfill it or change it later. Let's imagine hypothetically that the world was created chaotic or in a disorganized state, right? And that by the end of the time that he's finished creating the 6 days of creation and all of these things, he's not done with the rest of the planet. In other words, part of the planet is still disorganized. Is that a problem theologically? I say no. No, not at all, because it depends on why it's left that way. Now, if the planet was left disorganized, but his plan was for man to finish organizing it. It was man's job. And everyone always wonders, okay, if Adam and Eve were placed in the garden, what was their job? And they're placed there to do work, to carry out work. They had to have some work to do. And it very well could be that God left the planet disorganized with the intention of having work for man to do. God didn't leave it that way for no reason. He left it there for a reason, and that was for man to work it, for man to work out the planet. You have to remember that the garden is not identical to everything else that was on the planet. In Genesis chapter 2, he says, oh, no shrub of the field had yet sprouted. But then he says in a separate portion, and God created a garden, and he placed man in the garden. So it very well could be this idea that man had a purpose of fulfilling and taking care of the planet. And that was why he also needed Eve to be with him to go and fulfill these notions. So, is the idea that the heavens and the earth were created perfect? No, not at all. Pain and suffering. Okay, were there pain and suffering before the fall of Adam and Eve? I would suggest to you, yes. What does the Bible say? He says in Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, that God, I will increase your pain in childbearing. Increase. And even in the Hebrew, that's what it means. It means to increase, to bring up, to have greater pain and suffering. So pain and suffering existed prior, and Genesis 3:15 is saying is like, oh yeah, pain and suffering is not a new concept on the whole. No. Eve was going to experience pain, so pain and suffering were not going to be completely void of everything prior to the fall. And this is another distinction, right? When we're talking about the new heavens and new earth, most of us as Christians would believe that there's going to be no pain and suffering. Okay, so there's no pain and suffering in the future, but there was prior to the fall, or there was going to be, right? So God didn't create a world where there wouldn't necessarily be any pain and suffering of any kind whatsoever. No, I don't think Adam and Eve were created like, oh, God's going to strike them dead any moments just for existing. No. But did he create a world without any pain or suffering potentially? No, I don't think so. Okay. What else is different? Marriage. Jesus says that in the new world, the new heavens and the new earth, that people will be like the angels. They'll be not given in marriage nor given in marriage. This is a massive distinction, right? In the garden, Adam and Eve are married, right? So you have marriage prior to the fall. But this is something that won't be down the road. As well, children. You have children as the idea for Adam and Eve. Their idea is for them to what? Be fruitful and multiply. That's in chapter 1 of Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply. Everyone's going to multiply and increase. Will there be multiplication in the new heavens and new earth? Unlikely. I guess theoretically there could be, but I would say that the vast majority of Christians, and I would agree that there should not be any children in the new heavens and new earth by us. What was the purpose of the garden? Was the idea of the garden to be a paradise where man would live and exist and breathe forever, and there not be any problems or testing or trials? No, again, don't think so. Part of the point of the garden is to be a test and a trial for Adam and Eve. They were given this test of saying, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. ultimately we know they failed that test. But that was a test that we won't have in the new kingdom to come. The new kingdom to come is the fulfillment of all of the testing and all of the things that we go through here on earth. But it is not something we'll be facing in the future. So, now for some of the other questions that I had never considered before. Has our ecosystem changed? Has the entire system of how the earth functions changed? This is a very difficult question, and I very much understand and very much have believed in the past that this idea would be that it would all change. But what biblical evidence is there that the entire ecosystem of animals has changed? Especially right at Genesis 3 and Genesis 4, moving into this new world after sin. What has changed? We see God place about 3 curses. He curses the snake, which is not all animals. He curses Adam and he curses Eve. But where does he curse all of animal kind? Where does he doom animal kind to eat one another? Where does he doom animal kind that now that Adam and Eve have sinned, you will start to perish? Now that Adam and Eve have sinned, you as animals will start to eat one another. Where is that verse in the Bible? Like, I understand the concept. I understand the theological concept, but where does that come in here? Where do we see God cursing the animals? And I think this is a very interesting question. And so the notion is, has God changed the way that our entire world works? Because currently, our ecosystem, how plants and animals and us all interact, would be completely different if no animals ever ate each other. Animals currently depend on eating other animals. And some overgrowths of plants and stuff, it's counted on the idea that other animals will eat one another. If you take biology class, we learn about this circle of life type of principle. We learn about this idea that it's very much necessary. You know, if you just start to remove one animal class from a certain region, everything starts to get out of whack. It becomes more disorderly. It stays ordered when animals eat one another and you have certain, the whole chain of life, all these sorts of notions. So it's really difficult or really interesting to see is like, okay, well, why would God change everything to do with the entire ecosystem? And what biblical evidence do we have for this notion? Okay. God's purposes. For those that want to say animals dying is bad, all death is bad. We can't have death before the fall because then that would mean there has to be sin or these kinds of notions. I think this is only true if it was never part of God's purpose or plan. If it was never part of God's purpose or plan. In other words, if God created a world and he said it was good, and part of God's purpose for the planet, for the ecosystem, was for animals to eat one another, then that would be good. There wouldn't be anything wrong or bad about it. What was God's purpose for animals? Was God's purpose for animals that animals should have eternal life? Was it? I think that's so important for us to answer if you're to know that for sure. Man was created for eternal life to live with God. Were animals created for that same purpose? I'm not so sure that that is such an easy answer. And in fact, I just don't see anything to support this notion that animals were meant to live for forever. This also just cuts right into the idea of God's redemptive work. Okay, we know that Paul talks about, it's like we will be resurrected in the end of days, and we should have a physical bodily resurrection because we know we have seen Jesus have a bodily resurrection. Was that all part of God's plans for the animals as well? Like when man falls, is God thinking, okay, man has fallen, and therefore I will also raise up all of the animals? I will raise up all of the animals? That doesn't seem quite right. Even when we think about, okay, Jesus dies and goes to the cross, and we will be raised again. Why? Because Jesus came as a man for mankind, right? Why didn't Jesus come as something else? He didn't come as an animal. He didn't come as something else. Just because we had sin, sin is what? Just like it says in Romans 5. It's the thing that causes death for all mankind, right? Now, one might, of course, say it's like, well, because man sinned, it affects the whole planet and it affects all of the animals. Okay, but sin is passed down to the animals. Do the animals sin? I don't think so. And not only that, it's the idea that's like, well, okay, should death come into the universe upon the first sin? Now, it seems to me like they're kind of saying, yes, death comes in because of sin, the sin of man. But the sin of man likely isn't the first sin. The sin that first shows up is the sin of Satan or Lucifer, right? So then should sin enter into the universe when he sins? And if he sins, like, why should it affect the animals? But it's the same question. Why should our sin be the sin that affects the animals? Or is it just a matter of affecting creation? And again, like when I think of most of creation and the degradation of it, I see God's cursing on creation, but I don't see God's cursing the animals, which I think is rather peculiar. So, now, one of God's other major purposes and plans. When God says that in the day you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die, is he referring to physical death or spiritual death? What is it that God is focused on? God is focused on spiritual death. Now, does it mean that they will ultimately physically die? Sure. But God's focus ultimately has always been on these spiritual notions. It's been on the spiritual things that he's been focused on. This was the big thing that the Pharisees got wrong. The Pharisees were wrong about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus because they were focused on the physical rescuing of Israel. They were so sure that Jesus was coming, their Messiah was coming to set them free from the Romans. However, in this case, Jesus set them free. But was it from the Romans? No. He set them free from the powers of darkness and the powers of Satan. He set them free spiritually. He didn't set them free physically yet. So I think God was more focused on this spiritual notion. In the day that you shall eat of it, you will surely die. And they died spiritually, and they would die physically. So again, I'm not sure that his focus here is on this complete physical death of all of animal kind in here. Now, one of the other arguments that I think is a little bit interesting. Okay. Death comes into the world. Is it a great moral evil for animal death? Right? I think that there's a very interesting argument, and I just want to appeal to intuitions. And I totally understand if some people don't want to take this on at all, but I want to mention it. I think it's worth mentioning. Are the death of animals the same as the death of men? Now, obviously, I think most of you are immediately going to say no. Now, here's the question. Why aren't we all vegans? Like, why not? Why don't we believe that animal life is just as precious as mankind? Now, I think you'll very clearly see that there are all sorts of distinctions made between the life of man and the life of animals. And even when you get down to it's like, oh, what happens, if somebody kills a man, then God is requiring their life from them. But it doesn't have any prohibitions directly. It's like, oh, what happens if you kill an animal? No, and I just want you to think about this for 1 second, right? When we have an animal die today, right? Do we mourn over it like we do another person? No, we don't, right? Now, I know some of you are pet lovers and you absolutely love your dog or your cat, and those are very loving animals. But the reason that you love them is because you have a relationship with them. But I want you to think about this, right? When you see a stray animal dead on the side of the road and its body just obliterated, mutilated, and everywhere, how does that make you feel compared to if you actually saw a person on the side of the road like that? The difference is night and day. we're not anywhere in the same ballpark. Talking about somebody killing a stray animal is very different than talking about somebody killing a homeless person. Very different. And I think we all understand that intuition. The notion that an animal is anywhere compared to a man is not there. Not anywhere close. And so I definitely want to call into question this idea that animal death would be nearly as of a concern, that it would be the big thing that it's like, oh, no, you can't have animal death. Well, let's give some reasons why not. Like, tell me why not. Why couldn't you have animal death? So, if animal death came into the world before Adam and Eve, what would that mean? What does that entail? Does it entail, well, I don't know. Like, what does it entail? But I think it's very much worth thinking about, and it definitely has implications. Can you have animal death before Adam and Eve's sin? Can you have it before sin? If you can have it before sin, I don't know. What does that mean? What's the purpose of it all? Think about these things seriously, and maybe you'll have a better response to this video.